2026. Why you cannot scale without losing control. There is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history, in companies, in governments, and in financial systems. The more something scales, the harder it becomes to control. Not because people suddenly become incompetent, and not because corruption appears out of nowhere, but because incentives quietly shift as systems grow. Welcome to Money and Power. What you're about to hear isn't a business lesson or a management framework. It's a way of understanding how power, capital, and control separate over time, and why that separation matters far more in the years ahead than it did in the years behind us. At the center of this issue is a structural tension that appears whenever ownership and control are no longer the same thing. Economists call it the principal-agent problem. The principal owns the capital and carries the long-term risk. The agent is hired to operate that capital on the principal's behalf. In theory, their interests align. In practice, they diverge. And the divergence grows as scale increases. Authority expands outward, intent weakens, control diffuses. This isn't a failure of culture. It isn't about good people or bad people. It's structural. The mechanism is straightforward. The principal cannot directly observe effort, only outcomes. And outcomes are easier to shape in the short term than effort ever is. The principal thinks in terms of long-term value, resilience, and downside risk. The agent thinks in terms of career security, reputation, and visibility. Neither side is behaving irrationally. They're responding to asymmetric incentives. And over time, those incentives reshape behavior in predictable ways. This is how agency cost is created, the silent gap between what the owner intends and what the system actually does. To make this tangible, it helps to look at a historical example where scale, distance, and incentives collide. In the 18th century, the British East India Company was the most powerful corporation on earth. It had its own army, its own currency, its own legal authority. The shareholders, the principals, were in London. The officers, the agents, were operating thousands of miles away in India. The shareholders wanted long-term profitability. The officers wanted personal fortunes. Because information traveled slowly and enforcement was distant, many officers used the company's ships, soldiers, and treaties to conduct private trade for themselves. They returned to Britain immensely wealthy. They were known as nabobs. Meanwhile, the company itself, the entity bearing the capital risk, nearly collapsed and had to be rescued by the crown. The agents prospered, the principal absorbed the loss. This wasn't a scandal in the modern sense. It was incentive asymmetry playing out at scale. Once you see this structure, it becomes difficult to ignore it elsewhere. You see it in pension funds, where beneficiaries bear risk, but managers collect fees regardless of outcome. You see it in asset managers, rewarded for short-term performance, while long-term liabilities accumulate. And you see it in governments, running persistent deficits, where the cost is deferred to future taxpayers. As we move deeper into a period of sovereign debt fragility in the mid to late 2020s, understanding who holds the risk and who controls the decisions will increasingly determine the difference between solvency and erosion. This isn't about crisis narratives. It's about recognizing how systems behave when accountability and consequences drift apart. In modern organizations, the principal-agent problem rarely announces itself loudly. It appears quietly, as risk aversion, as incrementalism, as preference for career safety over long-term resilience. An owner may accept a large risk for a large return. An agent rarely will. If the risk succeeds, the upside for the agent is limited. If it fails, the downside is immediate and personal. So rational agents choose stability over transformation, even when transformation is required. That's why large systems struggle to adapt, not because they lack intelligence, but because agency costs rise as scale increases. Across history, systems that manage this tension rely less on trust and more on structure. Three mechanisms appear repeatedly: monitoring, that's oversight, transparency, audit; effective, but expensive and often brittle; bonding, that is deferred rewards, vesting schedules, reputational stakes, a way of tying future benefit to present behavior; and finally, skin in the game, where decision makers carry genuine downside alongside the upside. Not because it's virtuous, but because behavior changes when consequences are real. This isn't instruction, it's observation. The principal-agent problem never disappears. It can be managed, but it cannot be eliminated. In many ways, the history of money and power is simply the history of principals attempting to prevent agents from quietly extracting value as systems grow larger and more complex. If this kind of analysis adds value to how you think about risk, incentives, and power, consider liking the video. It helps the channel reach people who are looking for understanding rather than noise. And if you want calm, structural analysis of how money and power actually function beneath the surface, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. Because the most important shifts don't arrive with headlines or panic. They arrive quietly, long before they become obvious. Now, before I go, just a reminder that on the 3rd of January of 2026, I published a video entitled "The 5 Levers Quietly Shaping the Global Economy." If you haven't had an opportunity to watch this video, I earnestly suggest that you do so, and I have placed a link both in the description and the comments section below. It will prove the fundamental basis upon which much of our assessment is made during the course of this year. So please do not miss it. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video.